Mr. Noisey was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisey was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisey's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But when Mr. Noisey sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Now, this story starts when Mr. Noisey was asleep in bed. In his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. He was snoring. And, as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisey snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisey's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisey's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm clock in the world. Sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisey woke up. And so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisey's hill. Later that day, Mr. Noisey decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. The door wobbled. The house wobbled. The whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high wobbled. Then Mr. Noisey walked down the hill. He walked into the baker's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread,
boomed Mr. Noisey to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Then Mr. Noisey walked along the street to the butcher. He walked into the butcher's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat,
boomed Mr. Noisey to Mr. Bacon, the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. "We really must do something about Mr. Noisey being so noisy," she said. "Definitely," replied Mr. Bacon. "But what?" "I know," said Mrs. Crumb. And she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. "Mrs. Crumb," he said, "I think you've got the answer." The following day, Mr. Noisey again went shopping down to Wobbletown. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread,
He boomed. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" asked Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear.
I'd like a loaf of bread,
Mr. Noisey shouted. "Oh, I'm sorry," said Mrs. Crumb, putting her hand to her ear. Could you speak up a bit, please?"
I'd like a loaf of bread,
roared Mr. Noisey. "I can't hear you," replied Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisey gave up and went out. Mr. Noisey went into Mr. Bacon's shop.
I'd like a piece of meat.
Boom. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice.
I'd like a piece of meat.
Mr. Noisey shouted. "Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon.
I said I'd like a piece of meat,
roared Mr. Noisey. "Beg your pardon?" said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisey gave up and went out and went home and went to bed. Hungry. The day after, Mr. Noisey tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop.
I'd like a loaf of bread.
Boom. "A what?" asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisey started shouting at the very top of his voice.
A loaf of
Then he stopped. Then he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb." Mrs. Crumb smiled. "Certainly," she said. Then Mr. Noisey went into Mr. Bacon's shop.
"I'd like a piece of meat."
He boomed. Did you say something?" asked Mr. Bacon.
"Yes, I did,"
shouted Mr. Noisey at the very, very top of his voice.
"I said I'd like a..."
Then he stopped. And then he thought. And then he said quietly, "I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon." Mr. Bacon smiled. "My pleasure," he said. So, carrying his bread and meat, Mr. Noisey set off home up the hill. And then he stopped. Then he thought. And then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something that Mr. Noisey had never tried before. It was fun. And you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisey isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted. Especially Mrs. Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And you know something else? Mr. Noisey has learned how to whisper.